If you have trouble imagining a world before E3, you're not alone. A good majority of the population says that no such thing exists, but I'm about to wholeheartedly disprove that theory. Take a look at this! Well, if that won't get you going, I don't know what will. E3 is a long-running trend of the gaming industry. Every time they make a new year, an E3 press conference just has to coincide with it, except when it doesn't. E3 is every gamer's time to be alive. Even if you aren't particularly interested in what Microsoft's spurting out, at least it'll give you something to talk about at your uncle's funeral. But as a person of my stature would say, I'm more into Nintendo's E3 offerings. Just put me in the history books already. Don't quote me on this, but even though I watch other companies' E3 shows, I almost never enjoy them. And when I do, it's like, great, I wish I had an Xbox. I only usually enjoy them when they get absolutely wild, like with Keanu Reeves or whatever the heck this is. But Nintendo has always struck a chord with me, not because of their flashiness or wackiness, but because of their vast array of exciting first-party titles. Most of the time. Yeah, the thing with Nintendo is that if they don't have the first-party titles to back them up, it kind of all just falls apart for them. I remember back in 2018 when all they had of note to show was Super Mario Party and a name I can't pronounce. Its only saving grace was this beauty of a reveal, which is probably the only reason I came out of 2018 a sane man. But that isn't exactly what I want to focus on, because there's one extremely integral aspect of Nintendo's history that is often overlooked. That of course being Chibi Robo, with Space World in a distant second place. Space World used to be an incredible display of what Nintendo was doing in each particular year. These showings occurred from 1989 to 2001, and some of these are just as good as some of Nintendo's E3 showings, but you don't see people bringing these up all too often anymore, which might be for three reasons. One, these only took place in Japan, meaning not many people here in the States got to go and experience these events. Two, these shows weren't technically called Space World until 1987, and before that it was called, I really don't want to butcher this pronunciation. And three, they aren't even a thing anymore. And the footage of the earlier shows are particularly hard to find due to how both video games weren't a highly respected medium, and these shows are older than old. But I want to attempt to rectify those sins by covering every single one of these shows as much as possible. Just bear with me because, as I said, footage of these shows are incredibly hard to come by, and my biggest source helping me with this is Wikipedia, which is never a good sign. So grab your nearest time machine as we slide our way right into 1989. Wait a minute. Yeah, I think I might have gone a bit too far. First of all, this was where the first announcement of the Super Famicom took place, which is more commonly known as the SNES here in the States. This would go on to be a landmark console for the company, housing some of the best games ever made, and balls. So this press conference must have showed everything this console had to offer. This is the most disappointing I've been in history since World War I. The only thing that I can find that was reported at this show was a very early build of Super Mario World, which is kind of cool as a person who's into discovering anything and everything that this company is. But if you ask a bystander on the street if they care about this, you're either going to pick up a swift no or a restraining order. But for all I know, the show could have been more than just these two things. But I'll never know because I left my passport in 2022. But let's hop into the next year and see if that'll make a difference. It didn't. To be fair, this was the first unveil to the public of what exactly this was, which probably would have been cool to see just because I know how much those new consoles tug at my excitement glands. But other than that, not much was shown off. However, there were reports that they showed some more Famicom and Game Boy and Super Famicom games. These were shown off in what were called symbolic zones, and I would love to know what the heck that means. But because little information is known about the games that were shown, I'm going to say that they most likely had some solid offerings, but nothing that would make me jump at the chance to buy 4 Game Boys. This was probably a solid show for them all around. I just can't say it with complete confidence because so little is known about it. Maybe next year's show will have better information and be more exciting. No. All they did here was show Final Fantasy IV, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and a few other games. Given that it's one of my few birthrights, I'm pretty sure I'm disappointed. At least they had done things to show off the Super Famicom in 1989 and 1990. But now that the thing was out to the public, Nintendo barely had anything of note to show. But even if they had more games to show, I don't think this would have been nearly as exciting as previous years. And the fact that they didn't even have many big games to show really disappoints me. And if these are the two biggest games they had to make sure the public knew about, I highly doubt that they were on the honor roll of game lineups. Yeah, they're both good games, but these aren't nearly as groundbreaking as introducing a new console into the world. If they're only going to rely on their games, there better be quite a few of them for my eyes to latch onto. I'm confident in saying that this is the worst of what these shows can offer, and just know that it can only get better from here. But just in case, I got this gingerbread cookie to read my fortune. But the thing is, according to the packaging, I can't read my fortune until 1992. I hope it's worth the wait. The only thing that I could find that was announced at this show was the Super FX chip, a piece of hardware that was baked into some SNES cartridges in order to get them to put out more advanced graphics. This chip was used in some pretty noteworthy games, namely Star Fox and Yoshi's Island, but there's no way to confirm if those games were even shown off at the event, or even if they showed games at all. Even if it is rather likely that they showed off Star Fox because of its upcoming release, I can't prove it. It's like picking out a random stranger on the street and guessing if they still have both of their kidneys. Unlike 1991, this could have been a much better show, but because this show has easily the least information surrounding it, it makes it rather hard to judge because I know it was probably more than just this, but I don't know that it was more than just this. Luckily, we only have one more show to go in the lack of information variety. This show mainly comprised of 2 words and 6 syllables: Project Reality. This was a partnership between Silicon Graphics and Nintendo to truly bring 3D graphics to the next level. And for those of you out there thinking that Donkey Kong Country wasn't real enough, Project Reality answers your complaints in a way that ages rather poorly. Yeah, this was reality alright. But for the time, these graphics were cutting edge. Too bad the console that utilized them came out 3 years later. Project Reality would go on to be the Nintendo 64, one of the most beloved consoles ever made. And even if it wouldn't come out for another few years, it was still exciting that these graphics would be seen at all, and the development of the 64 would go on to set the stage for the next few shows. But overall, even if there weren't any real games to be shown, the mere fact that Nintendo would be delving into 3D gaming was enough to get everyone's mind racing. But one of the worst things about the long wait for the Nintendo 64 was that someone else would beat them to the punch. Virtual Boy. So this was the show where the Virtual Boy was introduced, and my god, people hated this thing. Many who got to test the console complained that there wasn't any head tracking, and the only color the console displayed was bright red, just so it could stick it to your retinas that much more. But what did these people expect from the Virtual Boy? They were living in the year 1994. Personally, I think the Virtual Boy is a pretty neat product that's cool to look back on, especially after its infamous failure. But I will admit that aside from Wario Land, there aren't that many heavy-hitting titles that made the system seem all that appealing, and Nintendo expected to sell about 3 million units less than a year from the launch of the system. That's the funniest comedy routine Nintendo's ever put up. Nintendo was obviously stalling for their next big console, which then got renamed the Ultra 64, and I can't decide if that's a better name than the console actually got. All in all, this felt more like a filler year, which is exactly what it was. But it wasn't all too bad of an event. An entirely new system is nothing to sneeze at, even if it is the Virtual Boy. Honestly though, I'm just glad there was actual footage of this event, and they didn't just go, why would I film this? It's not like it's a historic event worth restoring. Thanks for that, 1992. Now this is what you call a press conference. Even seeing as Nintendo's first E3 press conference occurred within the same year, it didn't detract at all from the amount of stuff they showed here. First of all, the Nintendo 64 finally had a name now. That's fun. Some of the most iconic games ever made were shown off. Super Mario 64, Star Fox 64, Mario Kart 64, and even The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Although Ocarina of Time was shown as Zelda 64 because at the time the game wouldn't be out for another few years, and it was still pretty early into development. And Mario Kart 64 was known as Mario Kart R, which probably got changed because of this. And Kirby Bowl looks like a cool game. I can't wait until it comes out. Yeah, there were a few nonsense games in there, but with this lineup for an upcoming console, I find it extremely hard to complain. Oh wait, I can complain about the 64DD. This is probably one of Nintendo's worst commercial failures ever. It was an add-on to the Nintendo 64 that failed harder than the economy. But at this event, it was seen more as a way for them to release more demanding games. But then again, if Nintendo was already getting insecure about their tech specs before the 64 even came out, that's when I would start to get a bit skeptical. But it wasn't an extremely large focus of the show, so it gets a pass. Other than that, this was a fantastic show with games that left an impact on the gaming industry that can still be seen today. This is exactly what the past few years have been leading up to, and it was definitely worth the wait. The Nintendo 64 was finally released a few months prior to the show, meaning that Nintendo could now show a lot more games that would be releasing for the system. Nope, they didn't do that. Why do I even get my hopes up? They had some really cool games to show, but the ones that I found to be the most interesting were eventually cancelled and reworked into other titles. Earthbound 64 was shown off and announced to be coming to the 64DD, but development would eventually be scrapped and now we have Mother 3 instead. And when I say we, I mean Japan. This is one of the most infamous Nintendo games to never have been officially localized, and people to this day are still begging Nintendo to bring the game over here. From what I've heard, this is a masterpiece of a game and one of the best titles on the GBA, but it just never worked out for us in the end. But one situation where things did work out was Kirby Bowl. Kinda. At this point, the game was renamed to Kirby's Air Ride, which is a game that most have at least heard of. This game was eventually cancelled, but it lived on through the release of Kirby Air Ride on the GameCube. It isn't known just how similar these two games were, obviously because one of them doesn't even exist, but they seem to have similar gameplay elements. However, games shown like Zelda 64 and Yoshi's Island 64 did eventually release, albeit with changed titles. If these two games weren't cancelled, this would be looked upon as a pretty solid lineup of games. It isn't as incredible as the previous year, but I'd be lying if I said the games shown didn't get me intrigued. Not again. The 64DD was shown off to the public for the first time, and they even put Super Mario 64 into the thing for reasons I can't begin to comprehend. I somewhat understand why they did this. Everyone knew that Super Mario 64 was the talk of the town, and showing that your new hardware peripheral was more than capable of running it is promising to its future. But it would have been a lot cooler if they showed a more demanding game that the 64 wouldn't normally be able to handle. It would have garnered a lot more interest in the product, and it would have justified what all of this was going to be. But while this show would go on to age poorly, at the time this was decently exciting for consumers. 4 major titles were shown, as well as something that would make the 64 even more capable than it already was, and I'll never forget the Rumble Pack. It truly makes me feel like I just experienced spontaneous combustion, and the recent release and promises of the Nintendo 64 made it so that this was truly one heck of a time to be a Nintendo fan. Now I have an incredible announcement to make, and I'm gonna announce it in the only way that I deem necessary. Hey You Pikachu exists. I didn't know how else to break it to you. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about this. These press conferences were finally renamed to Space World, which is what they're mostly known as today. If you say this nowadays, you're gonna get the stink eye. If you say this, you're gonna have a very in-depth conversation about the N64 mouse. But as for games shown, they were decent. A demo of Pokemon Gold and Silver were shown, and I'm going to give the same response I give in all of my dentist appointments. Neat. Ocarina of Time was even playable at the event, and having a game as big as this available to play is a great addition to anybody's LinkedIn. Super Mario RPG 2 was also there, which would eventually grow to be its own thing. This game looked quite good, and because this is where my favorite gaming franchise of all time was born, I crack a smile every time I see this. Banjo-Kazooie was shown as well, which turned up to be an all-time classic. Similarly, Conker's Quest was also shown, which eventually went from being a kid-friendly 3D platformer to holy crap! But while the games shown here were pretty good all around, this show had a lot more focus on specific hardware, like the Game Boy camera. This happened, which wasn't all too crazy. I stand corrected, they also announced a Game Boy printer. And the N64 mic along with Hey You Pikachu are some of my favorite things to complain about. But mainly, the 64DD was more apparent at this show. This show was where the 64DD promo was shown, and it's probably the first thing I think of when I hear 64DD. And they even showed the N64 mouse, which is a pretty good conversation starter. You should try it sometime. Even though the focus on hardware was a bit distracting, it isn't like they didn't show any games. They showed some great stuff, which I felt was mixed with the hardware in a way that doesn't come off too overwhelming or stupid. This was a pretty good show for them. Hopefully they can keep that streak up with next year. This is one of the more interesting shows to talk about. If you don't know what I mean, This is why. This conference was apparently cancelled not due to unforeseen circumstances or melanoma, but because of the 64DD. I'd blame this thing for taxes if I could. Nintendo didn't feel confident enough that they had any substantial titles for the 64DD to show off in public. And this thing wasn't even out yet. It was announced in 1995. This add-on was being delayed left and right, which made the product just seem less and less appealing. I'm fine with Nintendo not doing a Space World this year. I wouldn't want them to have a PR disaster on their hands, but it's still a bit disappointing considering how good the past few shows have been. After the non-existence of Space World 1998, 1999 picked up the slack with Doshin the Giant, my favorite giant yellow monster game, with Pack World being somewhere in the mix. Now let's play the game Two Truths and a Lie, Space World 1999 edition. I pray that this game is rigged. This show had a lot of games to back it up, but barely any of them were new. The only new titles of note that they show were Zelda Gaiden, which became Majora's Mask, and Doshin the Giant, which was on the 64DD. And Ultimate War was said to be the best looking game at the show. It's a shame there's barely any footage of it, because it never released. I'm confident in saying that this was a pretty subpar show. You'd think after they didn't do one in 1998, they would have more games than normal to show this year. But in reality, this is probably the lamest of the Space World press conferences made in the N64 era. The 64DD was practically flailing on the ground. There were too many old games, and there were barely any new games to get fans excited. Doshin deserved better. Now may I introduce the best Space World. They showed off the GameCube with women in latex skirts. Yes, exactly what I came to see. This conference was the first announcement of both the GameCube and the Game Boy Advance, two amazing consoles, introducing an entirely new generation of both consoles and handhelds. And what's even better news is that the 64DD was finally dead. It's time to celebrate. This is gonna be the best funeral ever. Nobody dared to speak a word about the add-on, and it had next to no presence at the event. Even though I'm inclined to say that I'm happy about it, the more and more I think about it, it's actually quite depressing. If it did what it actually set out to do, the N64 would have been made cooler than it already was. They had so many things planned for the device, and they put a lot of resources into it too, when those resources would normally have gone into cartridge-based games. If the DD succeeded, we might have gotten so many cool experiences like Earthbound 64 and Ultimate War, but because of the DD's failure, these projects were turned into cartridge-based games, and eventually faded into obscurity. If there was only one part of Nintendo's history that I could change, it would be the DD. Most people would say that the Virtual Boy is Nintendo's worst failure, but that at least released outside of Japan and had some notoriety behind it. The legacy of the 64DD is failure. They spent so many years building up to an add-on's release that would never amount to anything, but it is one of the most interesting failures I've ever seen. This thing had so many bumps and mishaps that I find everything surrounding it to be nothing less than fascinating. In other words, I'd pay $4 grand for this. And I can't believe it, Nintendo showed 128 Marios, the nerve of them. This is one of the most famous tech demos ever created. It was intended to be worked into its own game, but instead, its assets were used to make games like Pikmin and Super Mario Galaxy, and this is also where the Legend of Zelda GameCube tech demo was shown, which pleased fans who wanted to see a more gritty take on the series. We'll get to this. And Nintendo also announced games, and lots of them. Luigi's Mansion, otherwise known as Who's That? Yeah, Luigi was pretty underutilized at the time, and usually relegated to the spin-offs and RPG titles. He wasn't nearly as widely known as he is now, which is why making him the starting role of one of their biggest titles at the show was a bit of a risky move. But it did pay off in the end. For us, not Nintendo. Mario Kart for the GameCube was shown off in an extremely early development state, but it's nice to know that they're working on it. Metroid Prime was met with a lot of skepticism for being the first 3D Metroid game, and a first-person one at that, but it ended up being a great game that both critics and fans adored. And finally, Meowth's Party. It wouldn't be Space World 2000 without it. This was the best Space World by a landslide. They showed 2 new consoles that they'd be focusing on for the next few years. They had a good go-around of games, and this wasn't a thing anymore. Good for it. This is a role model that I'll probably be telling my grandchildren about. This is the last Space World event, and with this show, it's very obvious as to why. Now that E3 was becoming more of a thing, there became less of a reason for Space World to exist. There were only 2 major games shown off at this event, Super Mario Sunshine and The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. Super Mario Sunshine was a game that I'm pretty sure everyone was on board with. It was the sequel to Super Mario 64 in a tropical style. That was some pretty exciting stuff, but I've come up with a new hobby for myself. I'll get into cosplaying, a role I've always wanted to play as a Zelda fan in the year 2001. With that said, I think I should get back to talking about the event. I hate this. In terms of what I actually think of this reveal, I still don't like it. I know this would go on to be an incredible game, and I'm a pretty big fan of the cel-shaded art style, but this is the exact opposite of what people wanted out of a next-gen Zelda game. They wanted something that resembled the Space World 2000 tech demo because it looked like that was where the franchise would be headed. This looks like colors and shapes of the game. The trailer didn't really leave an impact either. It didn't show anything that would make me actively want to buy the game. They didn't even show the Great Sea, which is on a list of crimes that were never punished. This Space World didn't seem like the glorious and magical event that the previous one was, and it was apparent now more than ever that Space World was on its way out and ready to fully be replaced by E3. Those were all the Space World press conferences, and from 1994 onwards, they were pretty decent. And their showings in 1995 and 2000 are some of the strongest presentations Nintendo's ever given. I loved learning about these conferences and seeing how they could stack up by today's standards. And in that regard, I think most of these hold up pretty well. They brought so much excitement to Nintendo fans in the 90s and the early 2000s, and that cannot be understated. But it makes a lot of sense why it didn't continue past 2001. Why have two separate shows with minimal announcements when you can have one big show with big announcements? They might not be talked about all that much today, but I'll never forget them because of their games and products on display and the sheer amount of impact that it brought to the gaming landscape. Oh, and the woman with latex skirts.